case. So generally extracting the benefit from the ayat is one thing, especially when it comes to ahkam al-sharia, rulings and verdicts of the sharia. And then extracting a fatwa, really, that's a different matter altogether. So we are coming across ayat in which there are several rulings. They have to do with inheritance law. I'll mention some historical things and some matters of translation and explanation, but really the details are matters of the fuqaha. Allah Azza wa Jalla says, وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاتٌ يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. Very powerful ayah of the Quran. Allah says, particularly for you people, meaning the believers, in qisas, in this law of retribution that we talked about last time, al-hurru bil-hurr, wal-abdu bil-abd, wal-untha bil-untha, the slave for the slave, the free one for the free one, the woman for the woman. Everybody has to pay for their own crime. The biblical equivalent of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That law, Allah says that's called qisas, right? So He says, in following qisas, particularly for all of you, hayatun, there is life. Now historically, what does that mean? It actually means the Arabs were a very vengeful people. So when a murder occurred in one tribe, the other one would say, we're going to annihilate the entire tribe. We're going to finish off everyone. So it wasn't eye for an eye, it was eye for the entire village. That was their policy. Then sometimes wars broke out even over the killing of a sheep or something crazy. So now Allah is preserving the sanctity of life for all communities. وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاتٌ. This is the policy that's going to be implemented. In it, there's also a suggestion that this is not just going to be Muslims within themselves, but Muslims when also they have conflict with non-Muslims. That in any of those conflicts, the law of qisas is going to apply. This will be the foreign policy, not just the domestic policy of the Muslims of Medina. In it, there is life for you. But even in a general sense, not just in the historical sense, in a general sense, what Allah Azza wa Jalla has given us here is really a very powerful anecdote about society. When you implement the law of qisas, then you've left the death penalty open, which there is a lot of controversy around nowadays, right? The death penalty is inhumane, it's barbaric, it's archaic, we don't need to have it, it's not up with modern liberal times, etc., etc. And there are advocates for the death penalty and there are advocates against the death penalty. Obviously the Quran is not promoting the death penalty, it is leaving the option, because the decision is made by the victim's family. We already talked about that. But Allah Azza wa Jalla is arguing that when you have these options open, then first of all, many lives are saved. Because as a matter of fact, many a times the family will forgive. But what happens if a family keeps forgiving? If the only instruction in the Quran was, every time this happens, فَمَنْ عُفِيَ لَهُ مِنْ أَخِيهِ شَيْءٌ. That's it. Just let him pardon, let him pardon, let him pardon. The problem is if you keep forgiving, then criminals say, well, if I do commit murder, I know that chances are forgiveness. So there's going to be a big problem in society. Murder will spread because there's no serious consequence for murder. Criminals become more and more hardened. There's no real consequence to pay. And as a matter of fact, even in contemporary culture, there are people that have committed murder multiple times, and they say, even if I get arrested, well, I got my crew in prison too, so I'm all right. I can handle it. So they don't really see the seriousness of the consequences of committing such a crime. So leaving the option open that you will lose your life if you take another's life, that option open saves lots of lives. It maybe even stops a murderer from committing what he was about to commit. Just that. Not only does it save in the sense that some families might forgive, but it might save in that it stops criminals from taking that next step. Right? وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاتٌ. But Allah says, يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ, which I find fascinating. He didn't just say you particularly have life to be found in the law of qisas. You'll be preserving more life than taking. When we think about these laws, the postmodern thinker says, these are barbaric, this is inhumane, it's going to cost lots of lives. Allah is arguing actually if you don't implement this, it costs a lot more lives. It costs a life in the justice system, in the court, when the verdict is passed. But a lot more lives are cost on the street, and at a robbery or somewhere else, because this law doesn't exist. So actually, the loss of life is far greater when you don't have this in place. It's far, far greater. So now, he argues, Ya ulil albab, people of sound minds. Listen up, people of sound minds. You'll be the ones who realize this kind of law has life in it for you. What Allah is saying is that large groups of public, they don't tend to think clearly. They tend to think emotionally. It's called groupthink. They can get swayed by propaganda very easily. Most of the news today is actually very emotional manipulation. The tone, it's not just news, this event happened, and this event happened. The tone with which the newscaster will speak can actually inject emotions into you. make you angry about something, make you, afraid about something, make you upset about something. And they call it news, and funny enough, they'll call it fair and balanced, and the last thing it is fair or balanced. But what happens in a society when you have everything done by just a sway of emotions? Then you can make public outcries about something that's even legitimate. As a matter of fact, we're living in a climate now that if you hold an opinion, and you have reasons for holding your opinion, but it's not a politically correct opinion, it's not a popular opinion, then if you state that opinion, then you might lose your job, you might lose your position, you might, get sued and all kinds of things, not because you're irrational or what you're saying doesn't make sense or you're not entitled to your opinion, but enough people are offended, enough of a mob is created that nobody needs to be thinking clearly, everybody's afraid of the mob, so they all back off. This mob mentality exists. So now, by the way, the most interesting recent case of is an atheist, a former atheist, who is now, he considers himself now a moderate atheist. He actually argues that new atheism in the United States is a bunch of gangsters. If you disagree with them, then they'll insult you, humiliate you, they'll curse you. They don't just want people to accept atheism, they hate religions. And they're actually just as hateful as any other hate group. And he was part of it and he got out of it because he couldn't take it anymore. Like how hateful these people are. And they come across as intellectuals and philosophers and things like that. But actually at the end of the day, it's just a mob. So this is, وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاتٌ يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. If people are able to think rationally, clearly, then they will see the sense in this law and this legislation. In it, there's another indication by Allah Azza wa Jal that these laws are only really implemented when you have enough of a population of people in a society that can think soundly. In other words, implicit in this ayah is the importance of raising the level of education of the Muslims, raising the level of their thinking. Because the ahkam of sharia, you will not see the sense in them until the level of thinking has been raised. Ya ulil albab, la'allakum tattaqun. So all of you may be protected. Taqwa now in this ayah, beautifully, taqwa is not just at the individual level. There's my personal taqwa, that comes from fasting, but there's which means protecting yourself. But society also has to protect itself. Society has its own taqwa, and that's la'allakum tattaqun, subhanallah. Then from here, this was a case about the death penalty or retribution. This discussion leads us to what happens after death. After a death, there is the distribution of inheritance. So the natural next subject matter is that of inheritance. And this is one of the earliest laws revealed in regards to inheritance. I'll share with you, some of you may agree, some of you may disagree, that's okay. We're all Muslim at the end of the day. I am far more convinced of the argument of one of my teachers, Dr. Akram Nadwi, than anybody else, that there is no naskh in the Quran. In other words, there's no ayah that abrogates or cancels out another ayah. That the word of Allah is permanent and it's constant. And even if two ayat seem to be talking about very different things, then actually one of them is specifying the earlier one. It's not canceling the earlier one, it's simply specifying it. It's takhsis. Or takhfif in some cases. It's making things lighter, making things easier. But it's not canceling the earlier injunction out. So this ayah is actually early revelation about inheritance, which is general. And then the specifics came a couple of years later in Surah An-Nisa. So some people hold the view that these ayat that we're about to read have been cancelled. They don't count for anything because the ayat of Surah An-Nisa are already there. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam, my personal view is there is no such thing as cancellation in the Quran or abrogation in the Quran. The word of Allah is constant and permanent. And as a matter of fact, Allah gave the general guideline at first so people have some idea of how to implement this. And then later on when they were ready to handle heavier guidelines, then He revealed heavier guidelines. Okay? So He says, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمْ, it has been mandated upon you, إِذَا حَضَرَ أَحَدَكُمُ الْمَوْتِ, when the time comes that death presents itself to any one of you, إِن تَرَكَ خَيْرًا, if this person who death came to, if he had left anything good behind, khayran. This is important because sometimes people only leave bad things behind, like debts or crimes that they've committed against somebody else, and then they come knocking on the door. Your dad beat me up. Now he's gone, so I got to beat you up, or something like that. If you left something good behind, if you left money behind, land behind, property behind, good things that can be shared and other people can benefit from. إِن تَرَكَ خَيْرًا الْوَصِيَّةُ لِلْوَالِدَيْنِ. What has been written for you, what has been mandated is that you must leave a will for both parents. Al-wasiyya lil-walidayn. Wal-aqrabin, and the closest relatives, and those who are the closest to you. Meaning it could include, some say walidayn, beyond that is grandparents, uncles, siblings, etc. Right? All of them are included. Leave something good for all of them. No proportions have been mentioned yet. This percent goes here, that percent goes there. Nothing like that. Okay? Just leave something good behind and include these people. Bil ma'ruf, in a way that is decent. Bil ma'ruf means in what everybody recognizes to be good. In other words, don't leave your father with like a wallet, an empty wallet or something. Like, leave something decent behind. Leave something reasonable behind. And everybody knows what reasonable is. So at this point, Allah is expecting people to make sense of this themselves. When He says al-ma'ruf, He's not specifying, which means Allah actually puts a great deal of confidence in human intellect. Your ability to make sense of what is right and what is wrong. This is very important. We have to have some sense of what people deserve and what they don't deserve. And Allah will ask us that gauge He gave us inside of ourselves. So many times in the Quran, Allah will not specify. He'll say, ask your own conscience. Figure it out yourself. And we want a fatwa for everything. We want a fatwa calculator that calculates everything so we don't have to think ourselves. Allah demands that you think yourself. Ya ulil albab. And then bil ma'ruf. What is recognized? You know, recognized by who? By all of you. You have the sense. You understand. And then when He says this bil ma'ruf, He adds haqqan ala al-muttaqeen. This truly is a right mandated. Haqqan is actually nasb ala tawkeed. Truly a right mandated on people who have taqwa. It's absolutely necessary that people of taqwa probe their own conscience and see what they should leave behind. I'll say one thing about inheritance law here. It's really beautiful. You know, in some societies there are very wealthy families, like the Rockefellers in the United States or something like that, right? Or oil-rich families, right? Or you know, and they've passed down their wealth from one family to one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. And what happens in Islam is, Allah Azza wa Jal recognizes that if you do this, if you keep passing wealth down, meaning this child was born into billions, and he's going to keep it inside the family, they're going to keep it all within the family, then you know what's going to happen over time? That wealth is going to start getting sucked into this family, and everybody around them is going to get poorer. They're going to consume all the wealth, they're going to be the employers, the landowners, the aristocrats, and everybody else is not going to have what they have. You can only have so much wealth inside a contained village or in a neighborhood or something like that, you see? And then they're going to, lavishly spend and do all of this other stuff, and it's going to create this class society. So what did Allah do? Subhanahu wa ta'ala. Later on you'll learn, He revealed that everybody, the mother gets this much, the daughter gets this much, the sister gets this much, isn't it? Now the thing is, the mother, if she gets, or the daughter, specifically if the daughter gets and the sister gets, they're going to go to a different family. They're not going to stay in the same family. They're going to get married. And when they're going to get married, then that, let's say it was a patch of land, it got cut up and one chunk of it goes to the sister. When she gets married and has children and one day dies, a little chunk of it gets divided again and keeps getting split up. In other words, as generations come down, you don't actually have one family for 400 years holding on to the same patch of land. That doesn't happen. They don't keep building this dynasty so that wealth gets consumed by one group of people and everybody else becomes poor. It actually naturally, beautifully keeps on distributing wealth and distributing wealth and distributing wealth. SubhanAllah. It's one of the most beautiful things in our religion. This law of inheritance that kept aristocracies from happening. So when you wonder why you have super uber wealthy families in the Muslim world that have had wealth for many, many generations, then the answer is complicated. We're not exactly very keen on implementing. And I'll say one more thing about this on a social level, and that is that there are two things I've noticed. I mean, as I talk to people, travel, there are two things that I've noticed that they scare me. You have people that are religious in every other sense. Their clothing is religious, their speech is religious, their tajweed is religious, their attendance of salah is religious, their hajj and umrah is religious, their observance of Ramadan is religious. The two things where you don't find too much religion in them is when it comes to giving the mahr to the wife and when it comes to distributing the inheritance properly. Then I don't know what happens to Islam. Otherwise the deen is there. Otherwise, top to bottom, everything is very much on the sunnah. But when it comes to money and giving that money up, even to one's wife, which is mandated in the Quran, something happens. I don't know what it is. And really, if we're going to get to the ayat of Ramadan, I don't know if I previously did them, but right at the end of the ayat of Ramadan, you know the first thing that comes up? Financial matters. If you finally build taqwa in Ramadan, your money matter should get straightened out. You shouldn't be messing around with money. SubhanAllah. And this is at the end of the day, the biggest enemy of our taqwa of Allah is the love of wealth. Is that love of wealth. And people will violate these clear-cut ahkam and not consider them and say, well, I'm doing other good things in the religion, so I don't have to think about this too much. Subhanallah. فَمَنْ بَدَّلَهُ بَعْدَمَا سَمِعَهُ. Last ayah for the day. فَمَنْ بَدَّلَهُ بَعْدَمَا سَمِعَهُ. Then whoever heard the inheritance. This guy was dying. He said, give my father this much, give my son this much, give my, they don't have, it's general. And somebody heard it and they wrote it down, or they memorized it, and then they changed it later on. بَعْدَمَا سَمِعَهُ. فَإِثْمُهُ عَلَى الَّذِينَ يُبَدِّلُونَهُ. Then the sin of that goes on people who recorded it and corrupted it. In other words, it's possible that people who record the inheritance can have corrupt intentions. They're paid off by the older son or something. And they come in and they, kind of edit the inheritance and give more this way or funnel more that way. If they do that, then even though the violation was done, it's not the one who died had good intention, but it's out of his control. He left this world. It's the one who corrupted that will that is going to have to answer to Allah. Inna Allah sami'un alim. No doubt Allah hears everything, knows everything. Let's just finish the topic of inheritance. Anyways, then we can talk about the ayat of fasting next week. فَمَنْ خَافَ مِن مُوسٍ جَنَفًا. But the other situation is, not only is the recorder corrupt, but the one who is dying is corrupt. He says, I'm dying, but I don't want my son to have anything. I hate him. Now, and he croaks and he dies. No, that's not fair. You can hate your son, but you still owe him something. You could hate your father or whatever, but you still owe them. So you can't use your own bias against people when it comes to your death, because at your deathbed, it's no longer your money. It's no longer your money. This is a law of Allah that's being implemented. Just like you don't even own your body anymore. You're still worried about your money. You're even paying, the rent has been paid off for the body. You got to check out of here. Check out of this hotel. And you're still worried about where the money goes and where the land goes. This is a strange kind of bias, right? So Allah says, فَمَنْ خَافَ بِالْمُوسٍ جَنَفًا. Though anybody who was afraid that the one leaving the will had some kind of bias, was leaning against someone or leaning towards someone, أَوْ إِثْمًا, or they had evil intent, they had harmful intent. فَأَصْلَحَ بَيْنَهُمْ. Then he, after the person left the will, that he decided, no, I'm going to distribute this evenly. So he edits the will, but edits it for good intention, because clearly the one leaving the will had a bias. Then فَلَا إِثْمَ عَلَيْهِ. Then there's nothing wrong with doing that. You can correct other people's mistakes. SubhanAllah, as serious a crime it is to change somebody's will, Allah says when it means doing a greater good, then you change it. Allah's law is not black and white. It actually is as fluid as humanity itself. I'll give you one quick example of that and we're done for the day. And that is Yusuf alayhi salam. Yusuf alayhi salam wants to hold on to his brother. And he knows he can't do it. مَا كَانَ لِيَأْخُذَ أَخَاهُ فِي دِينِ الْمَلِكِ. He can't hold on to his brother in the constitution of the king. Because you're not supposed to keep those people in the royal palace. So what does he do? He schemes and he puts a cup in his bag and he checks all the other brothers' bags and then finally comes to the bag that he knew the cup was in already, and thus accuses his own brother of stealing, so he can be incarcerated, he can be arrested. And he did all of this. But you would say, how can a prophet lie and scheme and deceive? Because that's what that is. What does Allah do? كَذَلِكَ كِدْنَا لِيُوسُفَ. That's actually how we made the scheme for Yusuf. Allah says, don't you think he did something? This was our way of doing things. SubhanAllah. Allah took credit himself. فَلَمْ يَقُلْ كَادَ يُوسُف كَذَلِكَ كَادَ يُوسُف. This is how Yusuf made the scheme. No. كِدْنَا لِيُوسُف. We made the scheme for Yusuf that way. And then Allah himself explains, because he couldn't have held on to his brother in the constitution of the king. And even then you're like, what is haram to lie and to scheme? How could Yusuf alayhi salam do that? Some people are more religious than the Quran. How could you, I think less of Yusuf alayhi salam now. Oh, no. نَرْفَعُ دَرَجَاتٍ مَنْ نَشَاءُ. Very next words. We elevate the status of whoever we want. You don't get to reduce the status of Yusuf alayhi salam. And then he ends the ayah, وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ. And above everyone who knows something, there's somebody who knows more. You don't know the whole situation. Why did he lie? Or why did he put the cup into place? Because he was trying to save his brother. Now he had to look at two evils. His brother being in harm's way or being protected in his company. And he had to decide. And when he decided this, then he knows what he had to do. You don't know the full situation. So sometimes you don't know the whole story before you make a judgment. Somebody might come after this guy who changed the inheritance. How could you change the inheritance? Astaghfirullah al-azim. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. How could you have done this? And this guy is not going to expose a guy who already died and say, you know how corrupt his inheritance was? The guy's already dead. You don't want to add to his sins. So he doesn't say anything. And now people are blaming him for editing and changing and being unfair and da. And you know what? فَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ. Above everybody who knows, somebody knows more. And at the end of the day, Allah, but it also, this in the context of the ayah, Allah is teaching us that there are situations, you don't know the whole story, you can't be judged, you can't be quick in passing judgment. So these complicated situations will occur, where you're not going to be able to follow the letter of the law. You're not going to be able to bring a fatwa and slap somebody in the face and say, this is what we got to do. It's not going to work. It's just not going to work. And in those times, only taqwa can work. In those times. So may Allah Azza wa Jal make us a people of taqwa and help us appreciate the beautiful, remarkable ayat of Quran and make us those who observe the ahkam of Allah as they should be observed, with caution and fear. Barakallahu li wa lakum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.